From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life.
If we took a tape measure and we stretched it across the entire visible universe, okay, that's a big tape measure, across the entire visible universe, and it's in 1-inch increments, and one of the inches at one point, just one, is the life-permitting inch, okay? If you go to the, which way are we going to go? If you increase the gravitational constant, just move it over 1 inch, the universe just collapses on itself. Big crunch. No universe. If you take it the other way, let's make the gravitational constant a little bit weaker. Let's just move 1 inch the other way. Then the universe blows apart and you never get galaxies and stars and
no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or, another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God.
My question now, you don't really mention this too much, but I'm pretty sure that you agree with it. What are your views on, or I should say, do you consider yourself to be a young Earth creationist?
All right, this is an in-house debate among Christians, and let me just give you a few minutes on this because it's a very common question. First of all, does science show an old universe? And the answer is, if the laws of physics have not changed, the answer is yes, right? But the assumption is the laws of physics haven't changed. You have to make that assumption, like light from the stars. The speed of light is assumed to be unchanged. If the speed of light hasn't changed, the universe is 13.8 billion years old or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. But how do we know it hasn't changed? We don't, but it's probably a good assumption it hasn't. Why? Because if the speed of light changed, all the other laws of physics would have to change as well. But you're still making it an assumption. Sometimes salt in the ocean is used to try and date the Earth young. The problem is the deposition rate is assumed to be unchanged, and the beginning amount of salt and minerals is assumed to be 0. Radioactive dating, which is used to date things on the Earth, you're assuming the decay rate is unchanged, and in uranium dating, the beginning amount of lead is 0. These are all assumptions you can't prove. Now, what about the Bible? Does the Bible show that the universe is young? Let me ask you guys a question in here. What does the first verse of the Bible say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, when did God create the heavens and the earth? In the beginning. Does it say when? No. You say, what about the days? Well, the days begin in verse 3. The very first verse seems to indicate the heavens and the earth are created, but before you even start the days. So the point here is that since the initial creation happened before day 1, the Bible doesn't say how old the universe is. But even if you think the days do have something to do with the age of the universe, there's different usages of the word day in the first chapter and a half of Genesis. There's 24 hours it could be. There's also 12 hours. How do we know? Because it says he called the light day and the darkness night. There's 12 hours. There's also a period, like an indefinite period of time. In fact, in Genesis 2:4, it says, "In the day the Lord created," which is a summary statement which covers all 6 days. And we use this all the time. We use this, this phrase, day. Like if I were to say Jim Harbaugh was a great quarterback in his day at the University of Michigan, everybody would know I wasn't talking about 24 hours, right? I was talking about a period of time, an era. There's a fourth possible usage I'll get to in a minute. The third day seems to require longer because you got the growth of vegetation and fruit-bearing plants. Look, even if you put Miracle Grow on that stuff, it doesn't grow in a day. You say maybe God sped it up. Maybe he did, but now you're making an assumption you can't prove. And the 6th day seems to require longer than 24 hours. Why? You got the naming of the animals. In fact, Adam begins to name the animals late in the 6th day. You know how many animals, even in Adam's day, there were? And then, finally, the 7th day is longer because it hasn't ended yet. According to the scriptures, we're in the 7th day right now. According to Hebrews 4, we're in the 7th day because God is resting. Well, if the 7th day is longer, maybe the other days are longer. The bottom line is this. There is no conflict between science and the Bible. There's only a conflict between some interpretations of the scientific and biblical data.
This question is for Rabbi. You mentioned the story of that, I think you said he was Jewish and he was shot by, at that, I think it was a concentration camp or something like that. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a bit and pretend I'm Sam Harris. No pun intended, of course. You stated that God was watching. God watched the gentleman pull the trigger. If God was watching, why didn't he make that trigger not work? Why didn't he make that poor individual just pass out while he was digging the grave? I believe Sam Harris would ask that type of question and demand an answer.
Yes, I appreciate that question. Playing the devil's advocate, you said that why didn't God keep the man from pulling the trigger rather than allowing the man to pull the trigger and then watch over him and bringing about some kind of judgment? I would say this to you, that the supreme ethic that God has given to us is the ethic of love. It is the peak of all intellectual and emotional alignment. This thing we call love, which places value upon the other person of worth and as something to be protected. The point even the hedonist realized was that in pleasure also, value and love are the supreme ethics that can be treasured. But you can never have love without intrinsically weaving into it the freedom of the will. You cannot have love without the freedom of the will. If you are compelled by some machine to a certain decision, you can never love. You can comply, but you will never be choosing to express that sentiment and the reality of love. If love is the supreme ethic, and freedom is indispensable to love, and God's supreme goal for you and for me is that we will love him with all of our hearts and love our neighbors as ourselves, for him to violate our free will would be to violate that which is a necessary component so that love can flourish and love can be expressed. If you're asking for God to always stop the trigger, why not God stop everything else? Next time you hold a cup of boiling water, he makes it frozen water instead. Next time you're about to cross the street and you're going to be hit, he pulls your leg back. What you're asking for is a different entity than humanity. As wonderful as it may seem that in stopping that you think he is protecting you from that which is destructive, the greatest denial that you're asking for is the freedom of your will to be able to choose and to love God with all your heart and all your soul. When you've got love as the supreme ethic and the freedom of the will to choose that love, all of the other contingencies come in and can become explained why it is possible to either choose or to reject so that love can ultimately reign supreme. If you want compliance and some kind of a mechanical response, your question itself will self-destruct. You're asking the question because you're free to ask it, and you're free to ask it because you're free to love. And we think, for example, we know so much. The story is told in Mideastern folklore of this man who lost his horse that ran away. And when the horse ran away, the neighbor came to him and said, "You know, bad luck, isn't it? Your horse is gone." He said, "What do I know about these things?" A few days later, the horse came back with 20 other wild horses. And the neighbor came and said, "Amazing, it's not bad luck, it's good luck. You've got 20 more." Man says, "What do I know about these things?" His young son is going and taming one of the new horses. That young horse kicks him and breaks his leg. The neighbor comes and says, "Terrible, isn't it? Your son's leg is broken. Bad luck that these horses came." The fellow says, "What do I know about good luck and bad luck?" A few days go by and a bunch of thugs are coming looking for recruits to join their gang. And they're looking for all the able-bodied young men. And they're about to pick this young man but find out his leg is broken. And they say, "We don't want him. We're going to move on to the next house." So the man comes and says, "Good luck, isn't it? Your son's leg was broken." In one little series of episodes, we don't know what lies ahead. Why don't you wait till you stand before God face to face, and you will find out there were reasons why he didn't stop that trigger, so that you will see the heinousness of evil and see the majesty of love and good managing to navigate yourself but as a pilgrim's progress to come to the celestial city.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed His moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in His command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because He is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
And as the night progressed, I saw him pull out a Bible. And I thought, all right, another opportunity to take down a Christian. And so I said, David, you realize that book you're reading is horribly corrupt. And he says, well, do care to share? And I said, well, Jesus spoke in Aramaic, right? And then the early church spoke Hebrew, so already whatever they're talking about is a translated version. But then the whole New Testament is written in Greek, so you've got a translation of a translation by the time you get to the New Testament. But not only that, the main Bible, the one that the church used for the longest period of time, was the Vulgate. It was the Latin version. For over 1,000 years, they used the Latin version, so you got a translation of a translation of a translation. And then from Latin, it went to German, and from German is where it came to English. And that's why you have the ESV, the NIV, the NASB, the who knows what V. You got so many Vs, you don't know which one of them is the Word of God. And David said, Nabil, let me tell you something. We have in our possession today over 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts with which we can reconstruct the entire New Testament. And if we didn't have any of the Greek New Testament manuscripts, we have over 10,000 Latin New Testament manuscripts. If we didn't have any of them, we have 8,000 Coptic Syriac manuscripts. If we didn't have any of them, we've got 36,000 quotations of the New Testament. All of these by themselves are enough to recreate the entire New Testament. And the people who wrote the New Testament were the disciples, and these people were multilingual. They could understand Aramaic, they could understand Greek, they could hear in one and write in another without losing the message whatsoever. I said, David, you're making this stuff up. Because I have talked to so many Christians and not a single one of them has said that before. And he said, try me, let's do it. Let's study this together. Let's look into these things together. And I said, let's do it. So we started looking into these things. And I came up with a quick conclusion about the New Testament. And by quick, I mean it took me a year. But I figured out that the New Testament is truly accurate to what it originally said. If you study the history of the New Testament, you study the manuscripts, and you take a look at the evidence that we have, what they say today is what they have always said.
Naturalism is correct?
Yes, that you cannot prove that there is no reality beyond the material
there's
world.
Two separate questions here that have to be distinguished and carefully answered. I'll do it exceedingly briefing. Nature exists. If there's an argument against that, I haven't heard it. To argue that naturalism, therefore, is correct simply requires the additional view that none of the positive arguments for supernaturalism work. To declare that supernaturalism cannot be proven false is in itself not a positive argument for supernaturalism. I've
now,
made that
Dr.
point
Shook,
repeatedly.
from those two premises that nature exists and that there is no bridge to a supernatural reality, do you really think that it follows that nature is all there is?
That is the most reasonable conclusion remaining so far.
By what logical rule of inference does that follow? It seems to me that from those two premises, all that follows is we don't know if there is something beyond nature.
Let me try an analogy. Suppose, to see how my reasoning process works, let me try an analogy. Suppose you have a large sum of money you wish to invest, and I'm a broker, and I'm telling you the stock market's going up and up and up and up and up. And you say to me, well, now look, I'm pretty happy with my bank checking account. My money's really safe. Give me several positive good reasons for investing it in the stock market. And I proceed to give you one after another really weak in your judgment argument. And after you get past the third or fourth one, you stop me and you say, no, no, I'm not going to additionally try to put my money in the stock market. I don't want my money there. You haven't given me enough good reasons.
Okay, now,
the naturalist is somebody who
wait,
retains
look, this
belief in
exactly
nature.
illustrates my point. That person has not given you reasons to believe the stock market is going up. But that doesn't allow you anyway logically to conclude that therefore the stock market isn't going to go up or that it's going to go down. You simply have to withhold judgment. You see, it seems to me your reasoning here is logically invalid.
No, it's not logically invalid. It's simply conservative. I'm very conservative with my money.
Let's talk.
Let me again try to explain very briefly without taking up your valuable time. Look, suppose your stockbroker said, well, why are you so hesitant to invest money in the stock market? After all, you can't prove that the stock market won't go up. Should you say, well, come a day, I'm getting rich. I can't prove the stock market isn't going up. I'm going to get rich.
Come on, now look, Dr. Shook.
That's unwise
Dr. Shook,
I
please,
think.
let's be serious. The point is, the point is,
I assure you, I'm serious about
from
money.
the lack of evidence that the market will go up, it does not follow that therefore the market will not go up.
I just
but it
agreed
doesn't
to that,
follow
yes.
that it's going to go down.
I agree
and
with
yet
that point
naturalism is the view that there is nothing beyond the physical world on your definition, and you admit you cannot prove that by reason, science, and experience.
You're manipulating words. A naturalist is convinced that nature exists. Okay?
So am I.
You're asking the naturalist to additionally believe in the existence of the supernatural, and the naturalist is simply saying, give me some good enough positive arguments.
That's not
now,
the
we've
definition
gone
of
back and forth
naturalism you
on the-
give. Your
sorry?
definition of naturalism is that there's nothing beyond the physical world, that there's nothing in addition to matter and energy. There are no supernatural realities. And the absence of evidence for those leaves you at best with agnosticism, not with naturalism. Naturalism cannot establish its own worldview.
Quite right. It's unfortunate that we're back to debating terminology instead of reality. Look, this business of agnosticism is a bit odd. Suppose I were to say the reason why I don't believe in the supernatural is because, I have not enough good reasons to believe in it. Now, does this make me an agnostic or an atheist? In a weird sort of way, I'm both. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive terms. An agnostic is somebody who cannot prove that supernaturalism is false, but again, that in and of itself is not a positive reason to go ahead and jump into the
But has anybody offered in tonight's debate the claim that because you can't show supernaturalism to be false, therefore you should believe in supernaturalism? Who has argued that tonight?
Well,
nobody. I've given five positive arguments for supernaturalism, and we've not heard any positive arguments for naturalism. All you have said is that my arguments fail, but that doesn't serve to establish that the material world is the only reality there is. There could be something beyond it.
There could be something beyond it, and I've already told you it might be more nature. For all you know or anybody knows, I don't need the supernatural.
If it's more nature, it's not beyond it, right? That's a self-contradiction, friends. Those who say that there may be more nature beyond it, it's still nature. That doesn't say there is something beyond nature.
My question is, if humans and life were intelligently designed, then why do our bodies not show intelligent design so much as they reveal the evidence of evolutionary ancestry?
I'm glad he's here.
Well, this is going to keep us till after midnight, ladies and gentlemen.
Bye.
So I'm going to try and go to the heart of it. It poses an alternative, intelligent design or evolution. Now, evolution is a mechanism which consists basically of two things, natural selection and mutation. If you look around this room, you'll see we don't all look the same. Why is that? Well, there's been a good bit of selecting going on. And there are also mutations from which we all suffer. We're different. So that mechanism does something. That's not controversial. Some of what Darwin observed was brilliantly observed. But now the confusions begin. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Blind Watchmaker, said that evolution is the explanation for the existence and variation of all of life. That is false, because the existence of life is not explained by biological evolution. Now, let's assume that evolution does lots of things, but what it doesn't do is explain the existence of the mutating replicator on which it depends. And that mutating replicator is a micro-miniaturized factory of unbelievable sophistication. The language of life, the genetic code, is extremely ancient, according to what we're told. It's scarcely changed at all. And that raises immense questions as to how it could possibly have developed in the very short time available from the cooling of the Earth till it was cool enough to support carbon-based life, which goes back to a very short time after the Earth was cool enough. Now, this interests me as a mathematician, because the cell is an information processor. What we've got in the biological macromolecules is something that physics and chemistry do not know, in the sense that you've got a signaling system, you've got a code, you've got a translator of the code. Now, in every other area where we see anything like that, the inference upward to intelligence is instant and immediate. It seems to me, without going further into it, that if you look at a cell as an information processing machine, it then can be simulated by a Turing machine, which is a kind of abstract computer. And all of you computer geeks will know, junk in, junk out. And that, I think, is borne out in the sophistication of what the cell is and what it does. Now, chemistry and physics do not have the capacity to produce these things. They can't produce them by evolution, because evolution can't get going until you have a mutating replicator. So somehow it has to happen. And people have been working on it now since 1953, when Miller and Urey won the Nobel Prize because they thought they discovered the secret of life. Nobody knows. That is the confession of how life started. All I would suggest to you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is this: that if you look at it, whatever mechanisms are involved, the very nature of the entity that we have now come to understand is part of the carrier of life. The thing that it seems to me to instantly shout at you is that whatever else is involved, there is a designing intelligence behind it. You see, what we've got is a choice. It's between, in the beginning were the particles and energy, and somehow they came together to produce elements, which somehow came together to produce macromolecules, which somehow came together to produce life, which somehow came together to produce consciousness, which somehow came together to produce morality, which sometimes came together to produce the idea of God, because God doesn't exist. Or you have, in the beginning was the Word, and all things were made by him. That is, mass energy are not primary, they're derivative. And that makes sense. Isn't it fascinating that the longest word we know has been given to us in some of our lifetimes, and it's the genetic word that determines the human genome? We recognize instantly that short words are the product of intelligence. What keeps us back from recognizing that the long words are not products of intelligence? Could it be a prejudice that the solution has got to be an unguided naturalistic process? Why is there such pressure in that direction? Because, ladies and gentlemen, if life did not start by an unguided natural process, that is the end of materialism as a philosophy. And that's a very high price for some people to pay.